Hi everyone, I'm very happy to be here and to see all of you here with us today. And I'd like to first maybe say a few words about this weird creature of a workshop in the beginning of a conference, just to make clear what does it mean to make what's this disco what is going on here? To explain what we are going to do in the next hour and a half or so. We thought together that it might be fruitful maybe to present a few challenges, a few questions to the research of violence, as justly said by Professor Shamir, and that it is such a complex phenomenon with so many questions, and that maybe we should try to lay some I wouldn't say common ground, because I don't think that this talk is going to be in any way exhaustive. Okay, it's not going to be a literature review. It's not going to present the state of the art of the violence studies today, etc., etc. But maybe open a few questions that I hope that will enrich our next couple of days. Okay, some points that maybe tie between the different papers, the different scales, the different settings. But before we do that, because we're going to spend the next couple of days together, and because the name tags are not very visible to others, so maybe we will just start with a short round of introduction, just to know each other, to know who are you, where we're coming from. So let me just present myself. My name is Ariel Handel. I teach here at Aviv University, also in Bezalel and Ben Gurion universities, and I'm one of the editors of Mafteach, a lexical review of political concepts, and one of the topics that I studied during the last couple of decades is violence, mainly in the Israeli-Palestinian setting, but not only. Also think about the theory and philosophy of violence. So this is like the hat that I'm wearing here. And maybe, just if you can present yourselves in a sentence or two, and then we will start the talk. Do you want to start?
Okay, so you already know me. My name is Kadan. I'm a PhD student here in the School of Cultural Studies in Tel Aviv University. I don't want to speak about my research because I will later. So, Orphée.
Hey everyone, I'm Orphée Senouf-Pilpoul. I'm also a PhD student here in the School of Cultural Studies. I am writing my PhD thesis under the supervision of Dr. Orly Lubin. In my thesis, I examine how women's experience of sexual violence have only recently been publicly accepted as truth claims, apropos the Me Too movement, and what seems to be this regime of post-truth, as it is often described.
Hello everyone, my name is Ido Fuchs. I'm a PhD candidate, also in the School for Cultural Studies, especially in the program for comparative literature here. I write my thesis under the supervision of Professor Galil Shacham here and Dr. Manar Mahul. I write my thesis on different articulations of the question of return in Palestinian literature.
Yes, I'm Julian Orlovec from the University of Wisconsin. I'm focusing on the technological aspects of violence, including robots, drones, autonomous vehicles, and artificial intelligence. Thank you for allowing me to connect via Zoom.
Sure.
Hello everybody, I'm greeting all the participants who decided to spend your time on this seminar. I'm in the Helsinki Environmental Humanities Hub, hosted by the University of Helsinki, and I'm a literary scholar who started my research career from eco-critical studies, but then I switched to studying. But now I am more. My research project here is focused on studying the literary and cultural dimensions of nuclear energy, just in fictional writing. And today, I'm going to make presentation on nuclear fiction, slow hope, nuclear literacy, and intermediate eco-criticism. That's why thank you organizers for this chance to be online.
Thank you. Chiara?
Good morning, everybody. I also would like to thank you for giving me the possibility of participating via Zoom. I'm talking to you from Italy. I'm Chiara, and I'm at the very beginning of my career as a researcher because I've just graduated last year. I got my master's degree, and in my dissertation, I focused on the intersection of colonial and gender violence, and my case study was Palestinian queer bodies. And this will be also the topic of my dissertation, my presentation. Thank you.
That's it. Okay, so thank you. So maybe I'd like to invite the organizers to present their, I don't know how to call it, vision about studying violence, motivations, or what are the most urgent questions maybe that you see.
Thank you, Ariel. I'll begin. Well, I cannot explain how. I cannot explain how exciting it is to see everyone in person and online as well. We have been working on this project for quite a while, maybe 2 years since we started, and throughout the process, it has taken many forms. Today, I think it might be the best form, and it is the best because of its component, the promising speakers, the clever chairs that will join us later, the generous partners, the patient team and colleagues, and the community. However, and here I already entered the realm of violence, which in Hebrew is also linguistically related to silencing, we should also try to think of the ones who are absent. I will not try to name every person, a group of people or community, dead or alive, that are denied access or choose not to participate, because it is obviously impossible. Nonetheless, I'm sure every one of us can think of a few. While not denying this violent absence, I think that many of the conference's presentations and sessions, if not all, may offer a better understanding of it, in general and in our case in particular. From gender violence to racial violence, from physical violence to epistemic violence, from colonial violence to capitalist violence, from state violence to mass violence to intimate violence, someone always pays the price. In oppression, death, injury, debt, silence, absence, or many other outcomes of violence. However, the absence, as I mentioned, can be a choice, at least partially. Professor Amosi, probably when she returned, can give will elaborate on that, on how is it a choice to be absent. And this is, the absence as a choice can be seen as an answer, maybe a violent one, to other sorts of violence. And if one common thread that runs through the conference is one-sided inflicted violence, I think another one is reply to violence, or violence as a reply, or even relationships or affinities of violence. These are by no means the only approaches to the question of violence offered at this conference. And since my main aim is not to summarize this conference right now or to foresee the future, I will stop this analysis here and maybe turn to introduce myself again, or what interests me about question of violence. First of all, as you maybe understood from my self-presentation, violence is not my main project. It is my side project, which I hide, maybe not successfully, from my supervisors that I don't work on my PhD. Anyway, I'm currently working on an article on tire burning in Palestine, chiefly on its functions during Palestinian protests. You'll hear more about it tomorrow. And recently, I also began researching and writing on the legacy of the Palestinian activist, intellectual, and martyr Bezalel Araj. El-Araj's life, activities, and writing offer complex affinities between the commons and the community, the environment and resistance, and knowledge and practice. That's right. My concern with these affinities, especially with violence looming above, transcends the borders of academia. To be precise, my interest in these affinities and different questions of violence comes from my activity outside academia. Though it might not be the best idea to say in this conference, in any conference or anywhere, I regularly attend different Palestinian protests and political activities. Thus, I am deeply concerned with the theoretical and practical aspects of colonial, racial, and economic violence, as well as the limits of violence and its legitimization, and resistance to violence and violence as resistance. Returning to our conference at the absence, I can think of few friends, some dead and others in different life situations, that cannot attend this conference. Though, to be honest, even if they could, some of them would choose not to. That said, I believe that the conference presentation session can and will develop deep and new thought concerning this issue. Not only that, but I'm also sure that the conference will be violent in many instances. After all, as Fanon famously claimed, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. And if we aim for decolonization, and I do hope that we aim for that, we should let ourselves, at least partially, consider violent thoughts. Thank you.
Greetings all. لابد من طرح التساؤل: ما هي المعاني والتداعيات لعقد مؤتمر أكاديمي عن العنف في سياق عنفي بامتياز كهذا؟ وما معنى أن تستضيف جامعة تل أبيب التي أقيمت على أنقاض قرية الشيخ مونس ضيوفا من العالم لتتكلم عن العنف؟ وهل يعتبر هذا تطبيعا أم أنه إذا ما كان تطبيعا أم مشروعا نقديا رفضويا قد يتعلق فقط بمضامينه وأسلوبه وبعد. Thank you for listening patiently to me speaking in Arabic language, which is my mother tongue. So I would like to begin with a question. Could this act of speaking in Arabic in the opening of an international conference without translation be regarded as somewhat a violent act? And if it is, does that necessarily mean that it's unethical or wrong? In my research, I'm interested in the relationship between language, cognition, and culture. I started my PhD journey, conducted experiments to test the effect of changing the linguistic medium, for example, changing the language of an experimental task between Arabic, Hebrew, and English, its effect on different universal cognitive phenomena using metaphor comprehension and production. This research interest of mine grew from my background of being a native Palestinian Arabic speaker, while also being an Israeli citizen. For those of you who don't know, today there are a little less than 2 million Arab citizens in Israel who are the descendants of those who stayed in their homes after the 1948 war. Thus, creating a minority in a context of an intractable conflict in this shared space we call Palestine-Israel. One aspect of being a minority is also being a linguistic minority, which I'm sure many of you sitting here can relate to. But a linguistic minority in such extremely violent circumstances can even be more cognitively and emotionally stifling. So in my academic journey, I knew I wanted to quote-unquote point out the violence by carefully easing my way to ask the questions that can address and highlight the effect of being obliged to use hegemonic language of the oppressor in the daily life in the daily life of the oppressed. Throughout my journey, I focused on aspects of what is today referred to as the linguistic citizenship, which highlights the rights and responsibilities associated with language use and aims to create an inclusive and equitable environment where individuals can fully participate and engage in their chosen language or languages, and its relationship with cultural and individual identity. As a linguistic minority, translating oneself becomes the only option to truly speak out to the world. But this process, if not carefully reflected upon, often creates a hybrid form that is linguistically and epistemologically twisted. Therefore, I will argue that the collective knowledge is closely tied to specific communication channels and the use of symbolic instruments associated with it. For example, there is, in my opinion, an Arabic knowledge or a Hebrew knowledge or an English knowledge, each intimately linked to their respective cultures. And in the current deeply problematic structure of the Israeli social and political system, often manifested also in the bureaucratic academic framework, Palestinian academics are sometimes denied the right to develop collective and national identity by restricting their ability to produce knowledge in Arabic or knowledge that is Arabic. In such cases, here and around the world, minorities can feel alienated because on one hand they are disconnected from the dominant culture, and on the other hand they face difficulties in forming connections among themselves and constructing a shared cultural identity. One of the most interesting methods to inspect such claims is one that is derived from comparative literature, with a focus on semantics. For example, as my colleagues spoke before, if we compare the concept of violence in English and to its translation in Arabic and Hebrew, we would see a very subtle but important semantic differences. As the word violence in English has in it the verb violate, referring to the act of violence as that which involves some sort of violation, taking into consideration the condemnatory element in describing some act as violation. In Arabic, on the other hand, the word violence is often translated into unf, which is defined in old lexicons as being hostile and non-polite, not being socially acceptable or able to form interhuman connections. And worst, the Arabic definition of criminal, mujrim, in the Quran, for example, is the one who cut and severed the ties not only with the collective but also with God Himself. While in Hebrew, the translation of violence is alimud, which contains the root elem, which Galili spoke about before, meaning being mute or unable to speak. This spectrum of definitions can indicate the existence of fundamentally different conceptions of violence across languages and cultures. Finally, in my opinion, one of the most violent acts is the act of being deliberately mute, ilem in Hebrew, when it's possible to point out the raging violence. And as I mentioned before, pointing out the violence or the violation can be regarded as an invitation to collectively condemn it. Hence, in our circumstances, holding this conference in English, despite it being a hegemonic language, can serve as some kind of a middle ground, while you, those who listen will serve as the jury. Before I end, I would like to take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of me, Ido and Orphée, all the different parties who took part in funding and organizing this conference. And I will specifically thank the Walter Liebach Institute for the study of Jewish-Arab coexistence with its head, Professor Amal Jamal, and the administrative team of Aynat Moore and Bana Haj Yahya, the program for Judeo-Arabic Cultural Studies in Tel Aviv University with its head, Professor Galili Shachar, and the administrative manager, Michal Bondi, and staff of the School of Culture Studies, Revital Tzipori and Daphne Ainbar, the Porter Institute for Poetics and Semiotics, with its head Professor Uri Shem-Cohen and his administrative manager Adi Nahum, Professor Melet Shamir, of course, and the Tel Aviv University's International Academic Collaboration, Dr. Ariel Handel, Shlomit Simchi, Dr. Orphée Rosh, Dr. Dana Olmert, and I hope I haven't forgot anyone. So thank you for helping us make this conference take place in Tel Aviv University. So I'll give the stage to Orphée.
No air.
Yes. Jad, I want to extend all those thanks and direct them at you and Ido. For me, I hope also for you guys, this conference is a product of a long-term intellectual relationship between us three. And I use relationship because I think it reflects our shared interest in both form and content, our corpuses, fields of knowledge, our methods, the way we approach them individually or collectively. And I think it also quite telling to what we aim at doing here with all of you in the next 2 days. Before I'll elaborate on that, I want to address a question that seems to me quite fundamental. And the question is, what led us to organize the panels in such a way that do not conform with thematic or disciplinary common divisions? I think that a substantial part of the answer I find in the history of thought, as it offers us an approach to intellectual relationships that were not subordinated to our current disciplinary divisions. But then we can ask ourselves, why bother? What do we gain from embracing this approach seriously? What's the potential or the power of refusing this division? And I think that for me, the answer lays in how these divisions participate in the self-formation of discourses that excludes other forms of knowledge and other agents of knowledge by doing so. So these divisions, the exclusion that entail hierarchies of what belongs, what doesn't belong, what is appropriate and proper and what is not, what is high and what is low, are all those divisions are embedded into the very intermingled interest that we have here collectively. Post-colonial sex and gender violence, human and non-human violent relations. And if I'm trying to escape the thematic divisions, so I think one is obliged to ask herself about what do connect the different themes. And I think we're about to hear it in the next 2 days, that these divisions are ingrained into different considerations of violence, into its material, symbolic, affective, epistemic, and ontological dimensions. So I think that if we're trying to understand what connects us, we find ourselves using the method of abstraction. But abstracting the concept of violence enables us to trace, to analyze, to acknowledge different configurations of violence, to compare different conditions and effects of violence. But just as every theoretical account or differences requires, theoretical account of differences requires, we are here also inseparably devoted to the issue of violence as a political mission. I'm talking about the three of us, and I'm sure from reading all the papers that we're not alone here. So I think that this political devotion or mission means we try to understand how we got here, what brought us to this present, and by looking at all directions, thematically, disciplinary, geographically, etc., how can we be different, and how can our futures present can be different, abolished from many sorts of violence that we are now immersed with and participate in. So this is obviously not to say, at least from a realistic point of view, that there could be no violence whatsoever, but it does mean to do our best to minimize it quantitatively and qualitatively. To minimize violence quantity is a goal that goes without saying. Otherwise, we can assume we wouldn't be here today from all across the globe, or at least from a wide range of its locations. To minimize violence quality, on the other hand, I think it's another story. I think it's a continuing task of figuring out how mechanisms of power and domination disguise themselves to the point that we can't even comprehend the violence inflicted upon us, but more importantly, the violence we inflict upon others and the ways to resist it. So, the subtle ways in which violence is inflicted upon us on the one hand, and the easy way to go around this concept as a placeholder on the other hand, those are two sides of the same issue from my perspective in my personal research. The ability to articulate precisely what we mean by violence, under what conditions, and to theorize its effects are political as well as theoretical ethical projects that require, in my opinion, perspectivism. It requires to consider the possibility to be at once both the predator and the victim survivor, both the one whose intentions and actions are supposed to be pure and the one whose actions, wordings, practices, and perceptions are themselves violent. So I think this is not a task for a one-night stand academic and political journey. I think it's a task that requires us constant self-doubt, the ability to comprehend how we participate in others' subjugation, occupation, delegitimization, and humiliation. I think it means to question our subjectivity, our sense of selfhood, our identification with national ethos, with our gender identity and expression, and with their neutrality. It is a task of wondering how can we overcome our empirical proven tendency to judge others' intelligence, competence, reliability, truthfulness based on their appearance. Maybe it's also an opportunity to reconsider our dietary menu, to wonder in what ways some lives are worth living and grieving than others human and non-human who share this world with us. It is also an opportunity to judge our set of justification for each of those questions. So, is our struggle stems from a commitment for the next generation? And if so, why is that? How come the future is more morally stimulating and engaging than our present? How this assumption operates as one of the most oppressive mechanisms, and I mean specifically gendered and sex mechanisms, how this assumption provides the backbone for militant and xenophobe regime of justification. So considering violence as an invitation for those to contemplate, to think about those questions collectively, to take part in a relationship whose status is complicated, an intellectual relationship. I think, thank you very much for coming here, and I hope we will do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ido, Jad, and Orphée. And I'd like also to say that it was a great pleasure to think with you about the subjects of this conference, and I must say that I wasn't such an involved and clever and I don't know PhD student. I became clever much later, and I think that you're just doing an amazing work. So let me start with just a short example, okay, a short a question that I think may lead us to ask several questions about the nature of violence And I like to refer to a moment of contemplation of a Haaretz reporter, Amira Haas. She's writing about the Israeli occupation in the occupied territories. And at one point she asks herself, how should she write about, how should we read about the recurring phenomena of confiscation of water tanks in the Jordan Valley during the summer. A place, just to make clear for those who don't live here, with lack of water, more than 40 degrees sometimes, and people that live out of the grid, and they are really dependent on those water tanks for themselves and for their animals. And so this is how she writes. You can see the chain of those responsible for the confiscation, from the typist of the order through the one who takes the pictures of those criminal tanks from helicopter, drone, or with a regular camera, and to the learned jurist who drafted the military order that declared the aforementioned area as a fire zone, where the permanent presence of humans is prohibited, even if they lived there before, and where all construction operations, including allegedly a pirate connection to a pipe that carries fresh water to a nearby settlement, etc., etc. Okay, so she lists all this chain of actions that are part of what we can call a thirsting policy. Okay, a policy of making people thirsty, taking water from people that live there for tens of years, hundreds of years. It depends where exactly do we talk about. What is absolutely clear is that those people lived there before Israel declared the place as a fire zone. Okay, this is what is important. And she says that the problem is that this is a non-story when we talk about media. Okay, it's boring, it's not interesting to tell this story. And maybe it is interesting at one point, but then how do you tell it again and again? How do you make violence seen? And she says, yeah, we could concentrate on one act to find the one time when the soldier will also beat someone. Okay, where someone used their weapon, and then we can say, well, this is violence. But then we are in a way deceiving, because we hide the everyday mundane structural violence that is part of what we talk about when we talk about the Israeli occupation. Now, my purpose is not to take case studies and to analyze them, but to use maybe this very short quote to ask about violence as a social fact, meaning that it is something that lays out there even before the question of how do we understand it, how do we legitimize or delegitimize it, what names do we give to it, how can we explain it, expose it, etc., etc. And as a social action, as every social action, we can divide it analytically into four parts. One is the action itself. Okay, to ask what is violence, what happened there. Is violence taking a picture of a water tank? Is violence writing something? Is violence connecting the water tank to the tow truck? What is exactly this moment of violence? We can also ask about the perpetrators, okay, about the one who inflicts violence. We should ask about the subjects of violence, the ones that the violence is inflicted on. And we can ask, or we should ask also about the general structure of language and meaning, because when we talk about social facts, we cannot ignore that every such act is gaining its meaning from the language in its wider significance. Okay, how can we understand things when all we have is words that sometimes are also embedded within the structure of violence? So as I started saying, the maybe two main problems with violence is, first of all, that violence is both a social fact and a normative claim. Okay, when we say about something that this is violence, we try to condemn it. We say something about it that is not only about what is happening, but also how should we judge it. And then it means that violence is always part of a political discourse of what is considered or not considered as violence, and which of the violences are legitimate or non-legitimate, legal or non-legal, etc. But I think, and I would try to argue, that we should try to think about violence even prior to all these ways of understanding them, or of baptizing them into language. And then the second problem is that usually when we read about violence, we get the sense that that we know what violence is. Okay, we recognize violence when we see it, and then the only question is, how do we regulate it? How can we minimize it? How can we think about it, but not to think what is it? What is violence? So those two questions are of course related, and let me try to stress a few questions or challenges to the study of violence through those four different parts. Okay, the action, the perpetrator, the victim, and language. So I'd like to start by talking about the perpetrator of violence. And usually we assume, again because violence is also a normative claim, that people try to distance themselves from violence. It doesn't mean that people are not involved in violence, but it means that people would usually not call themselves violent, right? They will distance themselves from this title of being violent. But this, what I'm trying to point is to places where violence is a way of subjectivity, of creating identity. And what do I mean by that? We usually think of violence as something that destroys subjectivity. Okay, we think with Arendt, with Foucault, with others on how violence is destroying social systems, how it negates worlds, etc., etc. But we hardly think about what violence do to its perpetrators. And I think that some of the papers that we will hear in the next couple of days refer to that. Okay, to what does it mean to be part of, not of the victims, but part of those who inflict violence. And then how can we understand violence, even if, to be provocatively, sometimes violence is fun. Okay, people are looking for violence. People, GTA players, football fans, soldiers, policemen, gangs, I don't know, many groups, usually of young males, okay? Not necessarily only those, but definitely it's part of the creation of collective identity is done through violence. We can think of a phenomenon that talks about violence as the act that turns the thing, okay, the colonized, that is a thing, into a human being through violence, because violence makes subjectivity. But also we can think of again more powerful groups, okay, not just the colonized that are totally made into objects and now try to in a way rehabilitate their humanity through the act of violence, but also there are many researchers in the last few years that refer to the joy of violence among soldiers in different armies. And then sometimes we can see that those studies talk about the joy of violence, but of the precise and controlled violence, meaning that I'm, as a good soldier, can inflict violence, but just at the measure that it should be. Okay, this is I'm a professional in violence, and then I don't do the excessive violence, which is what they consider as a bad violence. But good violence is a good thing. It's part of the identity that is built among several years or a whole career in military service. But also we can see it, and again I'm referring to Israeli-Palestinian cases, but not only. Think about, I don't know, a policeman in the last demonstration that you've been to. Sometimes presenting power, presenting violence is part of what constitutes the social strata, yeah, the people that come together, and just to give one reference, a recent article that was published about the philosophy of violence of Rabbi Meir Kahana. Meir Kahana, for those of you who don't know, an ultra-nationalist rabbi, a Jewish supremacist, and an aspiration to many of our Knesset members today, and to many people in the Israeli population, talked and wrote about the transition from the use of violence as self-defense, okay, which he thought that would be a way, a tactical response to anti-Semitism in the US, to think about violence as a strategy. And in the paper, Rafi Reznik writes that Kahana indicated the three avenues in which he believed the Jews should help themselves: provocation, litigation, and violence. The avenue of violence particularly occupied him, both in practice and in rhetoric, because unlike the first two, the burden of persuasion in justifying violent actions is much heavier. But he did not try to claim that the tactics he advocated were not violent. He wanted to normalize the use of violence. Okay, this is what I'm trying to stress here. Sometimes normalizing the use of violence, and to stop apologizing for it. The claims that he and his friends who were violent encouraged him and strengthened his belief in the rightness of his way. Or in Kahana's words, young men and women learn to shoot, thirsty drink from the Gentiles, this art in which they excel. Okay, talking about this way of the culture of guns in the United States. So take guns, be violent, be different, be men. Okay, men up. This is how we can understand it. And so I think that this opens a question about being a perpetrator. Okay, like, what does it do in the structure of my identity? How does it produce societies? So don't think about violence or violent acts as singular. Okay, we have different acts that maybe are tied together because these are the same people. No, this is part of the structure of societies. So now I'd like to turn to talk about the subject of violence. And to argue from the beginning that the only way to understand what violence is to ask it from the point of view of the one that is suffering from violence. Because then it is the only way that we can understand slow violence, structural violence, all those ways in which we cannot see the acts themselves because they are spread on many different agents, on long time periods, on different systems of rules, regulations, different acts that are in themselves as discrete acts are not necessarily violent, but together they create the system of violence that when you see it from the point of view of the victim, you can see how it hurts, okay, how it breaks, how it dismantles. So the fact that underlying the thought of violence is that we are vulnerable creatures. We are our basic state of being in the world is vulnerable. We are as bodily and as social creatures, we can be hurt by many different things. We can be isolated, we can be insulted, we can be gaslighted. Okay, we can be invaded in many ways or isolated in many ways. Both may be violent. Okay, it's not only, we think of violence, it's usually the act of violation, but also to lock someone up is of course, or to isolate is a way of breaking social ties, and then it is also a kind of violence. So the object of the injury is the central anchor point for understanding this elusive phenomenon of violence. Ariel and Ido Fuchs write that violence is, I quote, the exercise of physical force that damages its object in a destructive way, penetrates, disintegrates, disrupts, hurts. After the impact, the object finds it difficult to exist in the state that preceded the impact, end of quote. And we can understand violence as exactly what is causing those breaking, disrupting, etc., etc. And this susceptibility to pain, injury, and destruction is something that has, we can say, an ontological existence. So even before we ask about legitimacy and about regulation and about law and order, etc., etc., it's important to note that the most important anchor is the question of injury. But the injury is not only bodily, of course, has been said, because then we reduce lives to bare lives, only to biological lives, and violence can be inflicted in many other ways. But I think that this opens again a set of challenges that some of them are going to be talked here. Regarding, for example, violence inflicted towards non-humans. Okay, what does it mean? So we can understand quite clearly why animals are also injurable, okay, hurtable, vulnerable. But how can we talk, for example, and I'm very curious to hear Joanne in the Zoom, to talk about violence towards robots, for example, and to ask ourselves, can we make a difference between a violence inflicted towards smart objects and towards stupid objects or mere objects? Do we have to assume some kind of conscious personality, etc.? Or maybe all kinds of breaking things, okay, of violence against objects is also a kind of violence. And how about blowing up a pipeline, right? And the question of, is it violence? If it is violence, is it a legitimate violence? Is it just a violence against violence? And then, it's part of the creation of ourselves in front of the industry of oil, etc., etc. And also, what about violence against urban infrastructures? And again, I refer to two papers that I remember now, Leonidas, Zohar. What does it mean to declare a war sometimes on the infrastructures of the city itself? And is it a way of claiming a right to the city? Or is it just a city negation, or is it also a way of making home in the city? How should we understand this urban violence when we think of places where we have infrastructural violence? That is, when the infrastructure itself is part of inflicting violence upon others, or just totally bypassing whole populations, leaving them to poverty. And can we talk about planning violence, planning such as in city planning, spatial planning? So if I'm thinking about, again, several places in Israel, Palestine, take East Jerusalem as an example, it is absolutely clear that we can talk about planning, about violent planning, and about non-planning as violence. Non-planning meaning the intentional not doing anything for the Palestinian city, letting it dismantle, collapse, rot, etc., etc. What does it mean that 34% of the Palestinian houses in the eastern part of the city are not connected to water and sewage systems? So if we can talk about infrastructural violence, what does it mean to be violent towards the city itself? And this idea of infrastructural violence, of violent planning, etc., also leads me to ask about the action itself. Okay, so we talked about the perpetrator, the victim, and when we talk about the action itself, so again, we are used to think violence as something that has a very specific appearance. Violence is something eruptive. It has a clear moment of start. Okay, we can see the act of stabbing, the act of bombing, the act of violating. It is clear who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. We can frame it into a specific time and space, and we usually talk about some kind of intention. Okay, and violence is many times understood as an intentional act to harm someone. But then when we talk about slow violence with Rob Nixon, about structural violence with Galtung, and many others, I'm not going to delve into it. I assume that these ideas are known. We can again ask, and I also refer to Amira Haas quote that I began with, how can we understand the action of violence when we don't talk only about eruptive violence, but also about other kinds of violence? And I think that this is one of the most problematic issues, because it is not only about understanding what violence is in a scholastic, philosophical way. Exactly because of this confusion between phenomenology and ethics, because when we say that something is violent, we say also something ethically about it, and not only something that is, scholarly. So that that we come into a kind of a paradox. The more the violence is structural, the more violence we have, we less see it. Okay, and that means that it creates a huge problem. It's not only the debate whether a specific attack is a terror attack or something made by freedom fighters. Okay, it is about the structure itself. It is about what enables the rape culture, what enables settler colonialism, what enables the large structures of violence that are embedded into, again, our language and our very way of understanding and giving meaning to the world. So the paradox of the more violence we have, the less violence we see, is something that I think is a part of the importance of considering violence, okay, of having this kind of discussion that invites people to say, see, there is more violence than we saw this morning. Okay, we should leave this room when we see more violences around us. And it also opens questions of accountability and responsibility. How should we understand the responsibility for violence when violence is so spread out? And how can we bridge those gaps between normative and factual questions? And also, how can we shift the discourse about violence from talking about legitimacy of violence to legitimacy as violence, to understand that the discourse of legitimacy is part of the economy of violence. Okay, it is one of the things that enables violence, that hides violence, that makes it possible. So if we, for example, talk about settler colonialism, okay, and as I said, I refer to Israel-Palestine in my examples, okay? So I'm not entering now the question of exactly what type of colonialism / settler colonialism, but I'd like to talk about the basic logic of settler colonialism, in which colonizers come to stay. Okay, this is the difference, the main difference maybe, between let's say classic colonialism to settler colonialism. People come to make a new home. They come, they cut the ties from their former homes deliberately, forcefully, and they create new homes, attempting to be the new natives, the new indigenous people of the place, the legitimate dwellers. And this way of trying to be the only legitimate dwellers of the place makes it a zero-sum game, an antagonistic relation in which every dwelling is a violent dwelling, because it is always on the expense of someone, sometimes physically, sometimes only as a symbol. But it means that we create this as our homeland, so it's not your home anymore, home or homeland. But settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, as Wolf famously said, means that it's not only this act of penetrating, dwelling, taking, occupying, etc., but it also creates the whole language that we use, the whole way in which we understand every action, the only way in which we can ask, I refer here to Jad's opening, whether talking in Arabic or waving a flag is an act of violence, okay? Because it is so much against this common language, so people understand it sometimes as like he began. Okay, he spoke in Arabic here, and and this is why I think, and we can expand this secular colonialism to many others systems of violent dwelling or violent being, when someone's existence in the specific system of language and of norms, etc., is negating the other in a way. So we can see that we can even say in a way that every violence is political. Okay, that it's not only political violence as one member of the large family of violences, and political violence is only the thing that is inflicted by the state or by groups opposing the state, etc., etc. But to see the politics that is inherent to every system of violence, because it creates identities, it creates groups, it creates language, it creates norms. It is the very idea of arguing whether something is violent or non-violent is from the beginning a political question. So I think that violence, if we see it as a basic component in the society, as something that is part of creating its society, etc., etc., is something that we can understand in a phenomenological way, maybe even I might say in a way, in a Heideggerian way, as a basic way of being in the world. The being in the world is always with others in many ways. Laurent Berlant talked about the inconvenience of other people. We always live among others with our affective borders, always with the potential of being penetrated and penetrating others. We're not those liberal atoms that just swim out there and merely touch each other. We are part of each other, and the ways of managing this multiplicity, this like in polytheism, polyamoria, etc. We know many ways of treating this polis, if we want. We have politics, and we have politeness, which is also a way of saying what is right and what is wrong, a way that can be violent sometimes. We have policy, we have the police, of course, and we can think of all of these family of polis as something that is part of the management of the inconvenient being with others. But when we talk about it, and therefore also maybe to reducing violence, but since those are so embedded into the social existence, it means that they are becoming violent as well, by symbolic violence, by actual violence of the police, by we talked about violent planning in the police. Okay, so it means that the very idea of multiplicity is always having this potential of violence into it. And I'm nearly finishing. One of the most common phrases when we talk about violence is the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence, asking who started, who began, who reacted, etc., etc. But this idea of cycle of violence usually refers only to the violence that we can see, to the eruptive violence. A murder is answered with murder, an attack is answered with attack, etc., etc. But I'd like to maybe suggest another way of thinking it, to think about the law of conservation of violence, like the law of conservation of matter or energy, etc., etc. It means that we have many, many forms of this matter of violence, and we have this whole flow of violence and this whole economy of violence, in which sometimes the violence is structural and symbolic, in other times it is eruptive, but it makes it very hard to point, to try to search who started or what is the real reason for the violence, etc., etc. And it opens an understanding of a whole ecology of violence, a whole sphere of violence, and I think that it enriches our way of thinking, and also it leads us to ask about the very option of non-violence, or what does it mean to talk about non-violence when we understand that violence is much more than the eruptive violence that we can actually see. In her last book, I think it's her last, Judith Butler talks about non-violence, and she suggests a concept of aggressive non-violence, meaning that non-violence, in the way she sees it, is not a way of weakness. It is not a way of withdrawal from power, but it is a way of doing exactly what she refers to, Fanon, being a subject, creating your own subjectivity, but while refusing to talk the Lord's, to use the Lord's tools, okay, to quote Audre Lorde. Meaning that if the system, the structural violence is so embedded, so maybe being non-violent, but being an aggressive non-violent, gains the same things that violence tries to achieve, but without being violent. It might even be more effective. But then what we really need to ask is what non-violence means when we understand that violence is so much tied into our social fabric. What does it mean for an Israeli, for a man, for a capitalist, for I don't know whom, okay, to be an aggressive non-violent? First of all, to be non-violent, okay, how exactly can we refrain from violence when we are part of the system of violence? And then how can we be aggressive non-violent when, what kinds of refusals does it take? What kinds of alignments, of coalitions, what kind of decolonization of language itself does it mean to be really non-violent in a world like ours? Thank you. So I hope I didn't tire you as much as I tired myself. And I think that in the 20 minutes that we still have, what we thought is maybe to ask you, the participants, maybe also the audience, if you would like to raise also some issues that you find through your own research or through, I don't know, not necessarily the case studies that you study, but being involved in the study of violence, and other issues that you find crucial to considering, contemplating, understanding, researching violence, hoping that those themes would be part of the discussion throughout the different sessions today and tomorrow. So if you want to